Så heter du. Nej, jag kan vara söka intressant.
Historiskan is the only magazine in Sweden that actually focuses on women in history. And in Swedish we have a sort of tradition of putting skan as an ending onto words like professions, if a woman has them. So a baker would be like bakerskan if it's a woman, or if it's the wife of a baker. So it's kind of a play on the putting a feminine ending onto the word of history. Well, I think for me it's kind of a two-part thing. One is just representation, because I think when you're in school and you, for instance, and you have your history lessons, and if you're a girl and all you're taught throughout your school or your education is that it was the men who ruled the countries, it was the men who made all the important decisions, it was the men who, brought everything forwards in areas like economy, politics, whatever, like men have always had the power. That to you as a girl sends a message that I'm not valued in any way. What I do or my actions won't contribute to anything, it won't change anything, and it's not true. There's a woman called Gertrude Bell, who was a British, she was an archaeologist, but she was also working for the British government, and she was integral in creating the country of Iraq, like setting the borders. She was at a meeting with like Winston Churchill and all these important men, and she was really, she had played a big role in this. But when you read all these men's, like their autobiographies or their sort of tellings about that meeting or things around that meeting, she's not mentioned. Like all the other important men are mentioned, but she's not. So even they're kind of changing history as it happens. One of our sort of main problems in doing this is because the content of the magazine is mainly freelance writers or scientists or historians that write for us. So for us, it's really hard to find people who can actually write about, for instance, South American history or African history or Asian history or Middle East history, and not just like portraits of women, but actual events where women played a part, or so we're always on the lookout for good writers who can write about something that's not just Swedish history or not just like Western European history. Well, I think depending on where you are in the society, so I can only speak for me. I think we've come a long way. I mean, there's a lot of the issue of equality is very much a political issue. So it's being debated very much by politicians and in the media, and there's a lot of focus on equality between men and women. And I think, wages, working hours, how many women are bosses, parent leave, if only the women are staying home with the children or taking care of the home and all that sort of thing. And I think there's also they're starting to look into, why society is the way it is. There's not a lot of men who have experienced in their life to be grabbed or fondled when they're like 12, or to be called, to be sexualized, or to be sort of pat it on the head and be like, yes, run along and get some coffee or something in the workplace. Maybe not as visible to everyone, but there's a lot of inequality towards women still. And I think it's harder to pinpoint than, for instance, difference in wages. That's very easy to look at and say, statistically there's a difference between what women earn and what men earn. I'm a journalist, and that's a very sort of male-oriented profession. It's starting slowly to change. We'll get there eventually, but it's still that sort of, when I started out, there was a lot of sort of older men in the workplace, and you could clearly feel their attitude as, this young woman coming in with, new ideas, or, don't tell me how to be a journalist. I've done this for, 20 years. And so there's still that kind of attitude, and there's a lot of, I think, sort of like male bonding. You pat my back, I pat your back, and it's hard for women to sort of breach that little kind of men's club attitude in the workplace or, in different places. In the sort of general outer structure, we are very equal. I mean, even though men can, or dads can, stay at home for half of the time, it's still, statistics show that most of them don't, because usually still the woman has the lower income. So when a family sits down to sort of, how should we do and who should stay at home the most, and and with the economy and everything, it's usually the woman that stays at home. And it's also usually the woman that gets, when it's time to retire, the women are sort of worse off because they've gotten less pay, because most of the time they're home with the babies or whatever. And it's such a boring story, but it's, it's basically in the 1950s, Sweden became the first country to have obligatory sexual education in all of the schools. And that kind of prompted a few sort of foreign journalists to come to Sweden to sort of, why is this country teaching their kids to have sex, as they thought it was. And a particular, I can't remember his name now, but a particular American journalist came over in the 1950s, and he was shocked because not only do we teach sex ed in school, but we also had, there's a sexual educator who's still very famous here in Sweden, who's called Elise Ottesen Jensen, or Utta, and she was basically traveling around the country promoting contraceptions, which was illegal for a very long time in Sweden to actually distribute or talk about or use in any way. She went around the country and she fitted diaphragms and taught women how to use them. So he kind of found out about this woman and the fact that she was just, as he saw it, throwing out contraceptions to everyone. And to him, that was just, shocking. So he wrote an article and called Sweden and the Sin, and kind of portrayed Sweden as a sinful country where, everyone was just having sex everywhere, and, there was no morals and no ethics and no anything. And that kind of snowballed. So in the press, Sweden was starting to be seen as a very sort of sinful country. And then it didn't really help that we had a few movies coming out in the 50s that were like nowhere near, it wasn't pornographic in any way, but there was, you know, breasts shown, and which was just crazy. And the women, there was a couple of films in particular, but like the women in these films were quite sort of okay with having sex, which was also like completely mind-blowing that a woman would want to have sex on her own, kind of, you know, take the initiative or whatever. I think Swedish people are quite open about talking about sex and sexuality and stuff like that, but I don't think that we're more like sexually active or more, you know, than anyone else. No, it's just that I think when that whole sort of image of Sweden as a sinful and sort of sexual country, when it first happened, the Swedish government tried really hard to sort of they sent out like kind of press releases to say like, no, that's not true at all. We're very proper, and you know, and trying to sort of change the image, because the government was also, they really wanted to sort of improve the whole nation. So there was a lot of improving living standards, improving medical care, and also, you know, sexual education to stop people from having a lot of kids and stuff like that. So they also, there was a kind of shift where they also said, look, we're not ashamed of the fact that we're educating people, and people have a right to know what's happening.